The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, you've mentioned that the IG, the Inspector General, is investigating matters related, for example, to the Clinton email server scandal, et cetera. But isn't it a fact that the IG does not have prosecutorial powers?
Well, under certain circumstances, the Inspector General works with prosecutors to bring criminal cases.
What about in this case?
Well, this is a matter that's under review at the moment, looking into the facts surrounding all those decisions.
So the bottom line is the IG is looking into the matter, investigating it, but has prosecutorial powers per se at this time.
The Inspector General does not himself have prosecutorial power, yes.
Thank you. The President of the United States, as the chairman mentioned, recently expressed the opinion that the FBI's reputation was, quote, in tatters, unquote. Now, as someone who sat on this committee, the Judiciary Committee that has oversight of the Justice Department and the FBI for over 20 years now, such a statement is, at least at first, shocking. But when you look at a few facts, it's understandable why the President might make such a statement. A former head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, is put in charge of an important investigation. And who does he pick to be on his team? Well, you'd want people who are experienced and smart and, most importantly, unbiased. Because whatever you do, the result is going to be second-guessed. One side or the other is going to be dissatisfied, critical. So above all things, they've got to at least appear to be fair and unbiased. So who does Mueller pick? He picked 16 attorneys. 9 of the 16, more than half, have given money to the Obama campaign or the Clinton campaign or both. And nobody has given a cent to Donald Trump or his campaign. Does that show a lack of bias? Does that show fairness? I think the American people can decide that for themselves. And perhaps even more shocking, we recently learned that one of those supposedly unbiased investigators on the Mueller team was a guy named Peter Strzok. Turns out Strzok was sending out anti-Trump, pro-Clinton messages, so he ultimately got canned from the investigation. The question is, how did this guy get on Mueller's supposedly unbiased team in the first place, when you consider that this is the same guy that had a key position investigating the Hillary Clinton email server scandal and apparently had a hand in altering the FBI's conclusion that Clinton was grossly negligent down to extremely careless so she could escape prosecution and thus stay in the race against Donald Trump. And now we learn that the number 2 guy on Mueller's team, Andrew Weissman, is just as biased as Strzok. He made an anti-Trump communication to the since-fired Sally Yates, and the depths of this anti-Trump bias on the Mueller team, it just goes on and on. It's absolutely shocking. Director Wray, I know all this took place before you took the helm at the FBI, but none other than the President of the United States has said that an organization that most Americans, including myself, hold in the highest esteem, the FBI, is in tatters. What can you do, what will you do to restore confidence in the premier law enforcement agency in the world?
Congressman, I appreciate the question and the reason for the question. It goes to the heart of whether or not the Bureau is following its processes and the rules and the guidelines and adhering to the independence and objectivity and professionalism that we all come to expect and respect from the FBI. And I think the best way that I can validate the trust of the American people in the FBI is to ensure that we bring that same level of professionalism and integrity and objectivity and adherence to process in everything we do. As I said at the beginning, I think it is important that we not jump first and ask questions later. So the second thing that I think can be done is when there are fair questions to be asked about things like whether or not some of the decisions made in the 2016 investigation were handled appropriately or were subject or based on any kind of improper considerations, rather than have the FBI investigate itself, having an outside inspector general do the investigation and report to all of us on the findings, I think is one of the best things I can do. And then based on that information, I won't hesitate to take appropriate action based on what it is he finds.
Thank you, and I'm almost out of time, but let me ask you, would you as FBI director, for example, ever permit associates of someone under investigation who themselves could also be under investigation to sit in an interview with the accused?
Well, I will say this. Having been, as I said to Congressman Nadler, both a line prosecutor and a Justice Department official, but then also a defense attorney, that's not my experience as the normal practice. I'm also, however, reluctant to ever answer questions, as you can appreciate, with a hypothetical about whether I would ever do something, because every investigation is subject to its own unique circumstances.
I sort of understand it, because that's exactly what happened in the so-called investigation of Hillary Clinton, and I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Director, for being here today, and thanks to you for your leadership of this agency and to the men and women who work so hard to protect our country and to serve the United States. We all appreciate it, even though we might have a few questions. My first question, has to do with cybersecurity. You know, there's a rapidly growing threat of cyber attacks at all levels, federal, state, and local, business, personal level. And I was really concerned to learn in November of a report highlighting the FBI's failure to notify multiple government officials that they were the target of a Russian hacking campaign. Now, at least according to this report, 500 people were targeted in the past year, including officials as high profile as the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the former head of the Air Force Intelligence. Many of these people still had security clearances or worked for the government. So I'd like to know, the FBI was, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, of these efforts for at least a year, but I am advised and informed only 2 of the targets. Can you explain why these individuals had to learn from the Associated Press that they were targets of an aggressive Russian hacking effort? And do we know if any classified information was stolen? Were any members of Congress or congressional staff a target? And what mechanisms or additional resources need to be put in place so that targeted officials know they're at risk when there's a foreign operation such as this?
Congresswoman, I think I'm not comfortable trying to discuss this specific victim engagements in a particular investigation, at least in this setting. But I think what I can tell you, which might be helpful in response, is that we have very well-established criteria and policies and procedures for questions of victim notification in cyber matters. And the questions, and I probably can't repeat them to you verbatim, but I can give you the gist of them. The questions go to things like, number 1, can we identify the victim, which in a lot of cases is harder than you might think. Number 2, is the information that we have at that point in the investigation actionable for the victim? Is there something they can do with it? You know, could sharing the information actually protect somebody, prevent a loss, et cetera? We also look at whether or not sharing the information at the time that we in question would potentially compromise or jeopardize an existing investigation or reveal sources and methods, which is often the case in these kinds of investigations. And the last point I guess I would make is that when you have a large number of people, it's much easier for us to provide victim notification when we have official or government or corporate accounts where we can contact the Chief Information Security Officer, and then they can communicate to all the people who are on that server. When you talk about Gmail accounts and things like that, it gets a lot harder because a lot of people's Gmail addresses don't have, Ray, C-W-R-A-Y, or,
Right, but for example, and I assume if what you're describing is the current practice, when the Democratic National Committee was hacked by the Russians, the FBI contacted an intern. They never contacted the chairman of the DNC. She found out, months later. So hopefully those types of procedures have been revised. Do you know that?
I think the procedures themselves remain the same, and the procedures themselves, I think, are pretty sound. The question of, but if you think about what they are questions that the investigators have to ask in each victim notification context.
Let me go. When we had the Attorney General here recently, we asked, there's an ongoing effort to hack into the election system. We know that from various reports. And the Attorney General said really nothing was going on, that he hadn't been able to pay. I'm paraphrasing. He would say, it's really important, we haven't spent enough time on it. I'm getting the sense that that's true across the government. In fact, we've got systems that were hacked a half an hour at DEFCON by state voting systems. What is the FBI doing relative to preserving the integrity of the voting structure itself for the next election?
Mr. Chairman, may I see my time? May I answer that one?
Yes,
thank you. Well, I think the FBI is actually very focused on this subject. It's one of the things that I've tried to insist on upon arriving. We have a foreign influence task force that we stood up that brings together both our counterintelligence division, our cyber division, and our criminal division, as well as some other parts of the Bureau. We are in coordination through that task force with DHS, which of course has responsibility for a lot of the election infrastructure, along with states. We are in contact with our foreign partners because, as you know, efforts to interfere with elections are occurring in other countries as well. And so that by doing that with our close relationships with our foreign counterparts, we learn more about tradecraft methods and things like that. So we're acutely focused on looking out for signs of interference in the 2018 or 2020 election cycle.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I know my time is up, but I hope that there is an effort by the Bureau to communicate with state election officers who oftentimes have been kept in the dark. And I yield back.